So I want to remind us of some of the reasons why this day is a day of congregating, assembling, as it's possible for you. Obviously, the current pandemic is not allowing many people to physically congregate, and we know that there are many people that cannot get online either, so are not having any time of fellowship, so please pray for them. But why do we do this on this day? Both church congregation and communion service. Well, here's a couple of reasons. Number one reason, it's Resurrection Day. All four Gospels record God raising Jesus from the dead near or at sunrise, after the Sabbath. That is what the Jews call the first day of the week. So we have Mark 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, says Mark, the two Marys bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. In Matthew 28, verse 1, same thing. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, the two Marys went to the tomb. Luke 24, verse 1, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. John 20, verse 1, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary went to the tomb, saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. The second reason is communion service, obviously. The early church had communion when they got together on this first day of the week. So we see that in Acts 20, verse 7. It says that on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Now, we know that this breaking of the bread was not a so-called private supper or a common meal. And this is based on what Paul later says to the church as an admonishment. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20. So then when you come together, says Paul, it is not the Lord's supper you eat. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, says Paul, one person remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Later in the same chapter, Paul says in verse 33, so then, Paul says, my brothers and sisters, when you gather to eat, you should all eat together. Anyone who is hungry should eat something at home, so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment. The third reason for Sunday is the collection for the saints. According to Jewish tradition, money was collected in the temple and the synagogues for charitable purposes. Now we see this in a story in Mark 12, verse 35 says that Jesus was teaching the people in the temple. And then later in Mark 12, verse 41 says that Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come. Now, this is important because it shows that for these first Jewish Christians, the temple and the synagogue had ceased to be the center of their religious observance. But more to my point, it shows the transfer from the Sabbath day, on which they were supposed to do this, mandated holy Jewish day, to Sunday, we call the first day of the week. Now, the last reason, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, the name Sunday was used for the very first time by Justin Martyr as a reference to the first light of a new creation. The encyclopedia says that the light of the world rose from the night of the grave on the first day of the week. Now, this belief goes back to the ancient rabbis who taught that there were 10 crowns that adorned the first day of creation. The encyclopedia goes on to say that Christians at the time of Justin Martyr were almost obliged to defend themselves against the charge of worshiping the sun. Remember, to this day, we have to battle so-called atheists and non-believers who say, You Christians are a bunch of idolaters. You worship the sun because you get together on the sun-day. So as we take communion, let's reflect on the spiritual and the historical biblical significance of the day as a tradition. But of course, it doesn't mean that we are mandated to meet on this day as such.